What's that?
Is it easier to deal with the screen facing it?
It may be.
Um,
Hang on.
Maybe like 2-3 minutes.
Yeah. You just,
Whatever.
I want to see what happens if I put this in a presentation mode.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, see, it blanks the screen too, so that's a bit of a bitch. Well, hell, I guess I'm gonna just have to,
Just mirror it.
just mirror it, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not, oh, no, so it has to come back down here, that's where I have my, oh, that's great, now,
Can, yeah.
it moved up there.
Oh, there's not a keyboard.
All right, so, you know, I may just present this in notes mode then, so I can see my notes.
Yeah.
Uh,
Nobody's gonna care.
So how does this? I need to move over here so that.
Good?
Everything looking good?
Yeah, let's try to find it.
They're coming up a drawer. So there's, yeah. Yep. And your live stream as usual too.
Let me know when you're ready.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, everybody, let's get started. Tipton is here to, I don't know, I have a question. When I edit the meetup description, does it inform anybody? Or is it just, okay, I'm gonna delete all those future meetups so that, so that I can actually send out a new invite. So anyway, so Tipton is here to continue the Flask series that he started 2 months ago. I don't know if you remember the details there, but, or if you saw my email about this last month, but this is kind of a deep dive on Flask, not just your, perfunctory, like surface level tutorial about how to build an app, but something about the internals about how Flask works. So I'm looking forward to it. If you look on the Meetup page, there's a link to the repo. If you want to follow along, you can take a look at the code. So that's what we're going to talk about today. If anybody wants to do a lightning talk, there should be room. You said about an hour, right?
Yeah, yeah.
If the monitor goes off, then no limits.
A little less.
So there should be room for lightning talks if anybody wants to give one afterward. Couple quick updates. Nola, if you want to come through while she's walking up, I just want to let everybody know I've been talking to the PyTexas organizers, and that is going to be back on the books for this year. The problem is all of us who previously organized it have recently had children and are not likely to be able to do it this year. So we're really looking for volunteers. We've got money, we've got expertise, we've been doing it for many years, we can support people in doing it, but we need volunteers to be the kind of committee, and we're more than happy to help. We just can't be the primary people right now. So so that's kind of an update on that. We're still targeting late fall, early, somewhere in the fall, which is what we've done historically, but if you're at all interested, please come talk to me, and we'd love to set you up for the committee. With that, I want to hand this over to Nola, who's going to make a quick announcement.
My name is Nola. I run the Austin Ruby group, but I've recently been into Python. And I'm going to teach a class for Go Develop It on Intro to Python, June 24th and 25th. It's a Saturday and Sunday afternoons for 4 hours and 4 hours. If you know anybody who's a beginner. So it's an intro level course. It costs $80. Most of it goes back to the organization. And it's also for women and men, even though the title is Grow Develop It. It can be for anybody who wants to learn. If you have any questions, you can ask me. I'll post a link to it on the Meetup page. Thanks.
Okay, I think with that, we're ready to go.
Ready to go?
And we know the ceiling mic works.
Let's try this out. Can you hear me all right in the back? Yes? All right. I can't see, so it's, I can't see or hear. Got it. All right. We're going to just continue from where we started a couple of months ago. I apologize for canceling last month. I thought I wasn't going to be able to make it. And then the case that I was working on settled all of a sudden. And, but we'll continue here. Visible Flask. The name for this comes from the old Visible Man kit that lets you take the organs out of the body and examine things, look at the skeleton, see all the insides. It doesn't make a person, but it lets you understand what things are made of. And that's the way that I'm approaching this discussion, is that there are lots of tutorials on how to use Flask, and you're welcome to use any of them, but I think that the explanation that I have here will help to ground you a little bit in using that. I should ask a question. How many folks here have actually used Flask for even toy development? That's, you know, a real project, or, okay. So what, about 75% of the folks here. How many of you have gone in and tried to find out something about how Flask works by going to the source code to see what it does? I got one. I got people with their elbows on the table and their hands doing this. Okay, all right, I got 3 or 4 folks, all right. It turns out to be a relatively painless and I think extremely worthwhile exercise to do that. I haven't done as much of it before I started doing this series. I'd done a little bit of it. I've done a bit more now, and I'm starting to get intrigued. These guys write very good code. They use what seem to me very obscure capabilities of the language. They use the syntax in a way that I haven't seen anybody else do before. Now, of course, part of the reason they're doing that is because they're building a wildly introspective system that's just looking at the parts that make it all go, and it's building tables and all that stuff. It's different from doing a database application. Nevertheless, I find it very, very interesting. So the approach here, this is the slide that I showed a couple of months ago, just an overview. This is far from being entirely accurate, okay? This is a sense of what's going on in the environment with Flask. And you start over with the browser making an HTTP request, get or post, something like that. It goes to a web server. Now, behind the web server is an interface called a WSGI interface. Yes?
Do you think you can zoom in? The text is very small.
Can I make it bigger? I can make it bigger, at least temporarily, if that's any better. That's as big as it gets, as far as I know. Actually, hell, let's try that. Yeah, but the WSGI I mentioned last time, I discovered fairly recently, it was pronounced whiskey. And that's where the names Flask and Bottle come from. The implementation of the WSGI interface on which Flask is built is called Werkzeug. It was built by German speakers. And a little bit of it, some of the protection, if you write very much web-based software, you're aware of the caution that you should never trust a client. And you have to be very careful. The It's Dangerous package, along with Werkzeug, is drawn on by Flask to protect against to protect the server against the client. But that implementation then is built upon by Flask. Flask is used then to write an application in Python that, in my case, I'm mostly interested in moving data back and forth. I want to start a session with the browser. I want to take data off of my server and send it over to the browser to inform the user about where he stands. And then he gets to select either navigation or some data manipulation and send those things back to me on the server, and I update things, and then I update him with the way things now stand, and then he decides what he wants to do, and the data just moves back and forth. It's a relatively simple request, or a relatively simple process that I'm interested in. I'm not really interested in all the internals of the HTTP protocol. I'm not interested in all of the ins and outs of protecting myself against the client. There are just a lot of a lot of the necessities deep down in that communication process that I really would prefer not to mess with, and Flask helps a great deal with that. Now, Flask with the Jinja process, the Jinja template manager also helps in constructing prettier web pages. You will see when you see my examples that I still haven't gotten to pretty, and probably never will. So Flask sits in this process going to here. This breakup down here is from here just to Python and then routes back to the response. But we're going to focus on the request object in the Flask application. All right. This is taken straight from the documentation of Flask, but it's something that strikes home with me. That one of the design decisions in Flask was that simple tasks should be simple. They should not take a lot of code, and yet they should not limit you. Because of that, Flask has a few design choices that some people might find surprising or unorthodox. Not so much interested in that last statement, but the first part of this, make simple things simple. There's follow the 80-20 rule. Almost nobody deals with e-tag headers, okay? So, accommodate the e-tag headers, but don't focus on them. And Flask does that for you. Then, just to set the context here, Flask is a framework that takes advantage of the work already done by Workzeug to properly interface WSGI. And this is the understatement of the year, which can be complex at times. It's important to understand that Flask is built on Workzeug. And so in order to read the Flask code, you often have to dig into the Workzeug package as well. And we'll do a little bit of that tonight. So, building on that other illustration, we have here web server to WSGI, to the Flask library, and then into Python. I should note that these are not matched items. It's just, this is the stuff going into Flask, this is the stuff coming out of Flask. This is not matched to that. This is not matched to that. That's not what I mean here. Just that these are some of the bigger elements of what's coming out of WSGI and Workzeug that the Flask application, and in particular the request object in the Flask application, is picking up on. And then these are some of the more significant detailed elements of what you use in Python in order to do what you want to do. That is, a lot of what's going on here, from here to here, is repackaging the HTTP request. The WSGI analyzes it, breaks it up, understands it, makes sure everything's okay, and then Workzeug repackages a lot of that. Now, it leaves a lot of it in its original form, but it also repackages a great deal of it in other ways to make it easier to use. Flask picks that up and does a little bit more repackaging to make it easier for the Python programmer to use. And one of the things that you'll see here is that a single piece of data may appear in multiple places, in multiple objects, but that's just the repackaging process trying to simplify the access to what's really important. All right. So we're going to start off here. This is what a Flask view function looks like. Usually, I say usually, that you have a couple of different ways of associating routes with functions. This is probably the most common way, I think, is by using a decorator that is based on the application ID, and then you give it a single parameter that is a route. It's a string that identifies a route. Worksoig builds a table. Oh, I'm sorry, I mentioned this in the last talk, but let me go ahead and repeat it here. Here's the way this works, and it took me a long time to understand this. When you load the module where this function is, Python executes the code. Okay? The execution of the code, if you're defining a function, just creates a function. Okay? When you have the decorator on here, this is a Flask decorator. It executes this, and it associates this route identifier with this function and makes an entry in a table. And this is how the routing is controlled in Flask. You have a table, and when you have a route, you have the function that's associated with it. Function's commonly called an endpoint. So, looking at this code, there's not a whole lot going on here. You define the function. You say it's got one parameter. I'm going to take that parameter and pull out from in this case, from a dictionary, an object, and then I'm going to, we'll get around to sessions in a minute, but I'm going to then render a template named this, and I'm going to pass this object that I looked up to that template to create the output. Now this is the way this is the essence of these applications, is that I'm going to take input from a user. I'm going to pull the information out of that, work off of it, build something, and send it back to him. I'm actually going to show you here where this comes from.
Hey, Tipton?
Yes.
As a reminder, is EXM there the app that you created?
What's that? EXM is the application name, yes.
Okay, that's not a library.
Yeah, I should say this. When you look at the tutorials, what you'll often see is I have something that's called app, A-P-P. And I have a directory named app, and then I'll have another directory named app, and then I have a file named app, and then I'll have an object named app. And I went through these tutorials for months, and it just pissed me off because I didn't know for sure whether it was necessary to give all these things the same name. And so as a matter of rebellion, I no longer name anything app. Okay? Everything gets a different name. Just so that you know that you can use different names. Now, I have acceded to, just because my shorthand for what programming is is programming consists of naming things and subroutines. And it's amazing how often we get stymied just trying to think of another name for something. So I understand some of where the app comes from, but still, it's overdone in these tutorials, and it's a lot better, I think, if you give things different names, just so that you can tell that they're serving different purposes and that the names don't have to match. The names do not have to match, okay? They just don't. The only place, I'm sorry, no name has to match. The most common matched name in Flask is the templates subdirectory, but even that can be renamed. So, nevertheless, so application route, this is the route identifier, this is the endpoint that's associated with it. The bracketing here indicates that this will be a parameter. This is a variable that gets passed into the function. You can stack these, more slashes, more brackets, or just more brackets. These can be typed, integers, strings. I don't know how many other types you can put on. If you can put user types on there, I'm not sure. This looks pretty simple. There's not a whole lot to it, but it exposes almost everything that you're going to want to do in one of these functions. So now then, let me go back to see if I can find this. Bingo. All right, we'll go back home. I'm just going to run through this. Unfortunately, the URL up there doesn't appear very well. Go here, and now it's this selection here that's going to be the one that we're looking at. This is the MS, and we go back to here now. Okay, what that sent was the following: localhost 5050 with an MS and then this long GUID. Okay, so that matches this route. The MS here matches the MS here. This string matches the string. It's used as a key to pull out an object from the storage, and then I pass that object back. Hang on. What you see on the display here is, I'll broaden this out a bit. Okay, I've got a file name, I've got a root ID for it. This is not terribly exciting code. Bunch of GUIDs on here. Set up like something like a master detail or header detail arrangement. So I've got a line here, and then I have several subject lines underneath it, another one here, one subject line underneath it. Okay, that's all there is to it. And that's what's being shown here. Okay, so that render template command at the end calls an HTML file, a template. It sends as parameters the MS object and a database session ID. I'm sorry, a database ID as part of the Flask session. So this is a piece of that exm ms struct HTML file. And it's just to show that the MS that was passed here is used, and we're just pulling elements from it to build that page we were talking about. And you can see here, this is the header line, and then these are the detail lines that come underneath it. So again, not a whole lot to this, but it exposes what's going on with this process. All right, now then, we get into where does this stuff come from? How do we get it? Last month I showed off if you start a Flask process and you do a dir on the application object, then you get big chunks, different files with different, I'm sorry, not different files, but different elements of the application object, and about 15 or 20% of them have the word request in them. So I want to take a couple of minutes and show you where the request comes from. The request, it turns out, if you look here, the request comes from a wrappers module in the Flask program. That's the main thing. And then there's a small r request over here also. All these other things relate to requests, and this is interesting down here where we're talking about, it says from signals import request started, request finished, got request exception, request tearing down. There's a lot of request management that's going on here. We may get to this at the end of tonight's talk, but I want to look at request here and see where it comes from. So I get into the Flask application object, that's the app.py up there. Even Flask calls it app. So these are a few of the lines taken out of there just to focus in on requests. Some of it comes from Workzoid, it comes from the routing module, some of it comes from exceptions. Some of it comes from modules in the Flask project itself. All right, when we get into the wrappers from the Flask application wrappers, we get request, and here's where it comes from. It says that request is subclassed from request base, and request base, it turns out, comes from Workzoid. Okay, it comes from an object called request, so of course we need to rename it in order to work with it as a modified object in the Flask application itself. All right, when you get over to Workzoid and you look at request, well, it comes from base request, not request base. That was the other, it's imported as request base. It comes from internally from base request, and then it has a bunch of mixins that are that are part of it. And I focus on this because accept mixins for accept header parsing, etag request mixin for etag and cache control handling. I don't want to screw with cache controls on the HTTP protocols. User agent mixin. The user agent is essentially describing which browser you're using, which version you're using, etc. This is what all of the internet guys use to fingerprint you so they can follow you forever. Is the user agent information. The authorization mixin, which is not exactly what you think it would be, and then common request description for common headers. So this is to say that the Workzoid request is tied in pretty tightly with the HTTP protocol request object. But we move on from that. Because, we import that request and then we make an internal request in Flask that's going to be different. It's going to be repackaged yet again so that we remember the matched endpoints and view arguments. So we didn't see the view argument, by the way, is what we were seeing is the MSID. The endpoint is the view function, and the argument, of course, is the argument to that function. All all right, we're not going to spend any more time on that. So this is what this is what the function looks like. And from here, we're going to start looking at some of the insides of what we get. So what I did was I took this function and I put a display call in here and then just wrote up, display these things for me. Okay, as we're looking at it, and I'll go show you that code here. All right. I'll make this bigger, I promise. Here, we'll do this first. And I learned this afternoon. I can make it bigger. Is that visible? You see it okay? All right. So what's going to happen is I just put a little demo function call in there that says, all right, once you start this function, just before you go to render the template, I want to see things that you're dealing with. It's relatively straightforward. Now you have to dig in a little bit either to the source code or interrupt things and do DIRs and get attributes and things like that to find out what to ask for. But you ask for the dir request, we're going to see that. And then in the request, we'll see something called attributes. And so we're going to go look at the attributes. By the way, you have to make a list of the attributes because if you try to print this down here, something happens. I didn't go all the way through it to find out, but this actually changes the attributes dictionary just running through the attributes dictionary. So I had to make a list out of it so that I could display it. Then session values. This is a cookie that Flask makes. And we'll find the session values. We get the request method. The request application, that's not really that much information, but it'll tell us something. We get the endpoint and the view arguments, okay? So we're going to dig in to find a lot of what's going on here. Where do we get the data that we work with in order to go find the data to send back to the user? Okay, so that little display function's put in right here, right before the return render template. By the way, you know what render template is? It's this says use this template, the layout, and once you have run through the data in that layout, you send back a response object. I used to think of the response as just basically a string. It's not. It needs to be packaged. If you send back a string, it sends back a string, a single character at a time. So the response object needs to be something other than a string, or you're going to wind up doing a lot of communication. So the first thing in there is to do a dir on the request object for the Flask application object. And that's what you get. Now, some of this stuff is more or less regular Python stuff. Some of it is Flask stuff, and some of it is HTTP protocol stuff. You can't tell looking at this what's what, although you might have a few guesses in here. What I've highlighted here are those things that it turns out I want to use to move the data in and out. So, the args, it turns out, if you use a query string in your URL, then the args is a dictionary with the key values and the keys and the values from the query string. Here, query string. The cookies, when you make an HTTP request, what happens is with every HTTP request on that domain, your cookies get transferred. The cookies from the client get transferred as part of the request to the server. The server can then ignore the cookies or do whatever it wants to with the cookies, but if it changes the cookies, or if it doesn't change the cookies, they go back, they get transferred back as part of the process. If it makes changes to the cookies, then the changes are sent back. So the cookies go in both directions every time there's a communication. Sorry, I gotta get a napkin or something and blow my nose. So the cookies are a way of maintaining some state between requests. There's not a lot of room in the cookies, and you can go to localhost or local storage and do more with it. I haven't used that. The cookies have been fine for me. The endpoint, as I referred to earlier, is the name of the function that you're going to wind up calling. The form, if you have a form on the client side page, on the browser page, if you do a post, then the form goes across. It goes across as a dictionary, and that form is made a part of, is an element of the request object in Flask. The method is just get, post, whatever is associated with it. The URL, I think it's transferred, and there are lots of pieces of URL stuff. There's a URL rule, there's a URL root, there's some other URL stuff up here somewhere. And the view args. The view args are in the example that we're working with is the ms_id, the parameter. So the highlighted parts are the things that you're mostly interested in using if all you want to do is move data back and forth. If that's what your process is, then those things will get almost everything that you need to do done. All right, so having seen the entire dir on the request, remember there's, where is it? There's a request attributes. We do that just to see what the request is made of. And there are 4 items: the environment, shallow, and I don't remember what shallow is about. The view args, which we saw just a minute ago, the MSID and the string. The URL rule, which is going to be the key for looking up the route. And the cookies. And the cookies starts with the session. There's a session cookie that's encoded, encrypted. Those are the attributes. Looking at the environment attribute first. The environment attribute, it takes a couple of pages to list everything out. But some of it's WSGI stuff. Mostly I'm not interested in. I don't need it. And then you get into HTTP protocol stuff that are very specific things. I'm not sure what the remote port is. So those are the individual elements of that, which again mostly don't interest me, because either WorksOrg or Flask is taking care of the communications part of this. I just have to manage the data going in and the data going out. Make a point here to show the HTTP cookie. The HTTP cookie, actually there are multiple cookies, is encrypted. I was running this from inside of PyCharm, so I have a PyCharm cookie there. I have no idea what's in that. I have the session cookie, and I'll show you the contents of that in a minute. Let's see. Not a whole lot more is really interesting here, except if you look down here, the Workzoid request, it shows this object here, which is the full URL and the method for the HTTP process. So again, then to finish off, that was the full environment. So here, the environment takes up 2 pages of stuff here. And remember, it was one of 4 elements. Whoops, I've lost my spot, pardon. Oh, that's what it is. So it's one of 4 elements that are attributes for the request. The other 3 are the shallow view args and the cookies. So we've talked about them already. All right. So the session. In Flask, there's a session object that is logically at the same level as the request object. Now, that session object is a repackaging of the session cookie. Okay, that's repackaged as a session object. Now, the session cookie, remember, is an element of the request object, but the session object is at the same level of abstraction as the request object in Flask. And when you look at a Flask session, the session is just a dictionary of key value pairs. All right, then the other thing we saw was the endpoint and the view arguments. And when I print those out, it's the same stuff we've seen before, but the endpoint, it's got a name, it's a part of something, it's readily accessible, and the view arguments are here. Now, in fact, you don't really have to remember that it's called an endpoint because in your code, the fact that you have identified this here just means that when this route is matched by Flask from the incoming information, well, from the URL, when this is matched, it calls this function with this value. You don't have to do anything more. Once you've done this definition, you have done all you need to do. The fact that this is an endpoint and that this is an argument for the endpoint, you don't have to manage any of that. I'm just showing you that within Flask, it is named, it's accessible. If you need to get to it for some reason, you can, but as with so many other things, you really don't need to get to it unless you do something truly extraordinary. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of curious.
I can't hear worth a damn, so. Well, what is it?
Yeah, just kind of curious. It seems the main reason like why the processing speed of Flask is so slow, because like you have to linearly verify.
Flask runs at the speed of my fingers, and that seems to be enough for me. So I don't have any. He asked if this is why Flask is so slow.
Well, slow relative to what?
I mean, I've heard like there's other like frameworks that like
async IO operation, or in other Python scenarios. So Flask is extremely fast in Python. If you want performance improvements, you can like switch to other languages like Go and that'd be a little bit
I
faster.
was thinking in Python though, like think about like web framework like Tornado or
Yeah.
or Sonic.
Those are all they're all really about the same. You can get async operations and you get some performance improvements in that scenario. But that would be but that's not commonly done.
Yeah.
And it's not, and you wouldn't do that here either.
So I acknowledge the question, but in the limited experience that I have, Flask works plenty fine. I'm using it for simple transactions, and it's as fast as I am, and that's all I require. So remember, Flask is that simple things should be done simply, and one of the things that happens when you use this framework is that a lot of things that if you were trying to write HTTP protocol operations on your own, you just don't have to manage anymore. So there's very little associated with cookie management. It's a little bit of dictionary stuff, and that's all. You don't have to worry about the cross-site scripting. It protects you from that. IDNA, hang on. I have to go look at my notes. IDNA stands for International Domain Names in Applications, and Flask takes care of IDNA stuff for you. This is just Unicode related URLs. I mentioned, if you remember on the second of the two flow slides up there, down at the bottom was data structures. And one of the things I found most interesting when I got deeper into the Flask and Workzoid is that one of the things that Workzoid does for you is it creates immutable data structures. A lot of the HTTP protocol is supposed to be immutable data moving over in headers and things like that. But in Python, when you move data in as dictionaries, dictionaries are immutable. And the guys at Workzoid created, I was looking a little bit earlier this evening, it's almost a 3,000 line file of data structures that are made to be immutable and to serve other purposes. So among other things, they make an immutable dictionary, and then they make something called a multi-dict. And a multi-dict handles the following circumstance, which I've never actually seen or run into, but in part of the HTTP protocol, you can have keys that have multiple values associated with them. That is, the keys are duplicated for different values, okay? And they made a multi-dict to handle that, and they made an immutable multi-dict so that you couldn't screw it up. This is very cool stuff. And then it turns out that an enormous amount of what goes on with the headers, and by the way, I've never asked, well, I'm sorry, at one point I thought I needed to do something with headers, and I did a little research into headers, but I didn't really need to. And in the code that I write, I don't deal with headers. I get the method, I get the get or I get the post, but I don't have to deal with headers. And maybe you will. They're all available. You can find them by the key with the header ID, with the header name. But it parses all the headers, divides them into all the different fields that you need. And again, simple things simple. It's not something I need. Flask hides it very neatly, but leaves it accessible. And that's a part of it where they talked about, I think, where they talked about unorthodox processes is some of the protections they're putting into place, making their own data structures and other things like that to acknowledge the HTTP protocol without dragging us into it. Okay, that's most of the talk that I had. I have this stuff up here because one of the things that happens in Flask is that it's built around what? It's built around managing multiple functions. It builds functions, it puts functions in dictionaries, it puts functions in lists, it puts functions in other places, and it's built to recognize that when you're working in this client server process, and so just take a simple case where you've got a database on the server side, and you need to reset your database connection each time you come back, okay? Well, they have, and I'm sorry this is a little bit small, but they have something called before request functions. There's a dictionary, and you can put a decorator on a function in your code, and if you put the before request decorator on a function, then that function is put into this dictionary. And when your request comes across from the browser into your Flask application, it has the route information on it. But before it goes to the function, I'm not sure, but it matches the route to the function that's supposed to be performed on that route. But before it calls that function, it runs all of these functions. Now, there's another, this is a dictionary. This is a list, and this list is before first request functions. So it recognizes there's a circumstance when you're starting an application process. There are some things that you want to do to initialize the whole process, but you only want to do them once before the first real function that you call. And so it's got a hook in there, and you can put as many before first request functions as you want, and it will execute them out of a list, which means in the order that you put them in the list. There's an after request function. Once you've finished your request and you get down to that render template thing that says, all right, put all this stuff out, before it does that, it will run all of your after request functions. And then way down at the bottom, tear down request functions. So after your after request functions, you may have to do some tear down of your request process before you finish off the request process and go into response. That is, these guys have put together something that gives you hooks into the overall flow of activity and give you rational places where you may want to put in extra processing, special processing, standard processing. And I think it's pretty elegant the way that they've done it. That completes my discussion of request for the evening, and I'll take any questions that you have. Yes, sir.
So you may have said this, but just to be clear, because that's a dictionary, you're not guaranteed the order of the before request functions.
You're not guaranteed the order.
Okay.
Now you are.
Well, right.
If you're using 3.6, you are.
Sure.
But no, you're not guaranteed the order on the dictionary, on the before request functions. But because the before first request functions is a list, you are guaranteed the order. Yes. Anything else? All right, that must have been extremely thorough, or just nobody cares. I'll take it either way. Thanks.
So Tipton, I think we're still on for next month as well.
One more,
One more.
and then your sentences are served.
I find talks like that fascinating because you use the request object in everything, right? And
Yes.
it's really important to understand the inner workings of it.
I think so.
And how to dive in on it and understand. So, thank you for doing that, and I look forward to next month. Okay, quick reminder, Girl Develop It, June 24th and 25th, okay, and $80, but anybody, that's a great cause, going back to Girl Develop It, so, that's cool. Talk to me if you wanna get involved in Pi Texas. Talk to me if you wanna get involved in OPUG, because, I've been doing this for 4 months straight now, and I'd love it if somebody else did. Anyway, does anybody have any lightning talks? I'm acting like everything's over, but nobody's said anything. Okay, well in that case, let's mingle a little bit, and then we have to be out of here by 9. So, thanks again, Tipton.
Yes, yeah, this is fun.
Yeah, no,
And I spent a lot of my life looking at other people's code.
Most of that's the old story.
That's what we
Yeah, you're paid to look at other people's code, not
And-
write it.
And the thing is, these guys write really.
It's some of the best I've ever seen.
It is.
Yeah, they're actually, well, so Armand Richter is is like a go-to name. He's got such hegemony that even a testimonial from him can put you on the map.
So, Ronisher is
Yeah, I've never heard it pronounced.
Armin Ronisher.
Oh, still. All right, yeah.
Go to that site.
I was just thinking, what might have been really cool is if you included a bit where like you like sort of hack the code of the request object and show like some of the things you could do with that, like now that we've sort of broken it down, like maybe like hack it a bit. Yeah, and like
Well,
see if-
I actually want to do something. I haven't done any of it yet. The thing is that there are comments in here that indicate that this is made to be subclassed.
Sure, yeah.
It's made to be hacked. It's made to be,
You can make like a JSON request object, right? So
Yeah.
that's one
one
way.
way of looking at it, yeah.
One object.
No, that's one of the things I find truly fascinating about it. He talks about subclassing the application object, subclassing the request object, subclassing the secure cookie session object. And he gives not really good examples, but if you look in a few of the tutorials, you'll find a guy who will subclass an application object. He won't do very much to it, just a little tweak, and fix it up, set it up so that it runs a little bit differently from what you expected. I didn't know enough about the execution space in order to feel comfortable doing that early on.
Well, yeah, that's
And
the
I'm-
customs though.
And I'm
That's using
adapted
a
to
bit
it,
more.
and I'm adapted to it now, I just use it for what it does.
Sure, right.
But if you have something specific you wanna do, it looks to me that in the same way that he built the multi-dict and the immutable dictionaries and other things like that, he's subclassed some standard objects, and he's built his stuff to be subclassed as well.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Django also has a multi-dict, for what it's worth. Like, I think a lot of frameworks have this multi-dict too, because use cases
Yeah.
in particular, you have. I had to with that.
Have you?
By the way, yeah.
Well, I have, like I said, I did a little bit of work with headers at one point because I thought I needed them or could use them or do something that turned out to be unnecessary. But I found out a little bit about headers, naming your own headers with the X as the prefix for any non-standard header, and a couple of things like that. And I had a few templates that were rendered with special headers, but they I didn't really use it after all. It was another conduit for data, and I didn't mention it, but really that's about it. Yeah, cookies, forms, query strings, and headers.
Yeah.
And I think that's about it for getting data across from a client.
Yeah.
But
Which
any one of those
is the
will work.
body, right?
Well,
Like,
yeah,
just-
but you don't mess, I'm sorry, I guess you can mess with the body if you're using some Ajax type kind of stuff. But just for the user standard.
Sure.
But I've got one thing where I use, I do a 204 return,
Mhm.
which is, no payload. My life just changed when I found that. Wow.
You don't have to put anything in here.
Yeah. I just get something happen, and I don't have to move anything over there, and it holds my page, which was always the hard part for me. So,
I think that next one, probably out of town, but maybe the month after, I was thinking about, because this was requested back in February, like a deep dive on HTTP semantics, talking about those kind of like the.
I'm not necessarily the best guy to do
I'll
that
do it.
because I
I'll do it.
avoid that through this process.
I am a status code junkie, so.
You avoid it for as long as you can,
Yeah.
Right.
and then you're thankful that you have Flask, because
Yes.
then when you need it, it's there.
It's-
You need it when you need it, it's there.
One of the things with other competing programs is they hide everything from you until you need it, and when you need it, you basically have to throw away all your code.
Yeah.
Because you just can't get the core, the raw
You know,
stuff.
I didn't communicate that really well, but that's part of what I get
Yep.
at,
And
is
yet-
that not only is this code really
And-
nice,
and-
it's thorough.
And and back in the day, 15, 20 years ago, the only thing you ever had was the raw stuff.
Yeah.
So.
How do you feel about Python? Like, text coming out of the
And,
Yeah, so,
yep,
I appreciate getting to do this, by the way. I think I'm gonna go in and start on Ronisher's code and just really understand some of the stuff that they're doing. It looks really obscure to me right now. But when I was picking at it just a little bit, and a few of the things, he's got when he does these data structures, redefines his data structures, he has a little shorthand thing that he does that's very cool. He calls it underscore identity. And underscore identity is a lambda function that X just is X. And he uses it, I'm not sure quite why he uses it. I'm not sure, except maybe just draw attention to the fact that I changed these things and all the others are identities, that they're the same as they were in the super object. But I don't know. Again, that may just be a thoroughness thing. I can't see otherwise a reason to do it. But
Maybe so you could inject your own language.
maybe, I don't know.
one of the things I noticed is when you're digging into the code, you're going deeper than almost most practitioners ever need to make, so you can make an entire company out of a liquidity event without having to go into
Right.
Warsaw and the complexities of what's going on there. But you showed a Warsaw class that had a whole bunch of mix-ins.
Right, that's the request for
Why?
class and workshop.
Usually in Python, if you have a whole bunch of mix-ins, you probably shouldn't be looking at that code.
Yeah.
It's most people are getting things done, you don't need a mix-in, and the mix-ins are like some people like doing infrastructure code or
And
something
that's what
like
I'm
that.
saying, is just exactly.
Yeah, they're more apparent.
Once I dug down to that, you realize he's using this, and yeah, I didn't use the word in the talk, but what he's doing is he's being thorough.
Yeah.
He's addressing everything.
And that's a huge number of mix-ins in Python.
Yeah, it's 5 or 6.
Yeah, very rarely do you ever see that much.
Yeah. And that's the only place it occurs, so far as I know.
And you should, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's kind of intimidating to see. So
Yeah.
almost to everybody making products, they don't need to worry about that side.
What?
And know that they're probably going to run across that.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's.
But the idea of doing surgery on it makes a lot of sense, to understand what's going on.
I started working, my first business in 1977, working on Hewlett-Packard computers. And I visited HP and did some other stuff, and
Somewhere in the back half of this year, we'll probably.
I was introduced to HP in those days, calculators.
Yeah.
Again, HP
Yes.
calculators.
Yeah.
Do you know that
Yeah, no big
on an
deal.
HP calculator in 1977, it was
We're really
impossible
open
to wear the number
anything that's
off
web
of the key
or Python.
because
They were
they were injected completely
Yeah,
through the
right,
meat.
exactly.
You could take a knife and peel out an eighth of an inch, and the number would still be.
But it's colored, it's a different
Yeah,
color.
I mean, you know,
So it's basically,
Yeah.
the keys are
I'm
made
all the
of
way
two
in
pieces
this way, I
of
know to help
plastic,
out.
like the white plastic.
Yeah.
But let's put me down and
So
maybe I can
the
do
wipes,
it for
but the white runs all the way through.
If I could-
Okay.
Okay.
If you would be
Another
interested in
one was
we can schedule it if you
a
want
friend of
to, so you
mine
don't have, like,
told a story
Oh,
about
yeah.
something like right now.
being at the
If I wait long enough, the JavaScript frameworks will change.
co-op.
Exactly, you know, your
On
bills
a
will
day
come
where,
right by October, so.
Hewlett Packard rep was showing off calculators. Again, this is mid-late seventies. And, you know, he was, you know, illustrating this and
We're
that.
getting through.
And some guy in the back of the crowd says, I got my TI calculator here. It's every bit as good as the HP. And it costs half as much. And the HP guy unplugs the calculator and threw it across the room. Wham!
Yeah.
All the way across the room. Rattles up into the corner and out on the floor, and he went and picked it up and brought it back and turned it on and showed him. He says, all right, I dare you.
Tornado comes up a lot, just because one of the other organizers was a big fan
Now,
of us.
HP didn't continue that forever.
No, they did not.
There's a point at which maybe you can't do that. Then there's actually a book from the eighties, I think.
There's been,
By a guy named Philip Crosby,
and then a few like
titled Quality is Free. And
visualization kind of.
he had the single best thumbnail description. Quality is performance to specifications.
Continuum was first starting out.
Yeah.
What I liked about it was,
They're
With that
you can't
bookcase.
have a
Yeah.
quality item
Either
unless you have a
Oh, really?
specification.
Okay.
And the example, one of the examples he gave was, say
But
you're
it's-
building
It has
a
been a while since. we've
mobile
done
home,
it. Like
and
this year is kind of a back to the
you
basics.
specify a doorknob that takes
A good, a solid.
100,000
foundation of
terms.
Semantics and
Okay.
decimal semantics, like.
if you build a doorknob
Everybody
that
did
takes
it.
5 million terms, it's not a quality piece of
I
goods.
always
It doesn't
assumed that like it
perform
was
to spec.
Django, maybe 50%, and Flask
and
25%.
That's where
I
the
was just
HP
looking at the
calculators
definition, it
were
says it's Django and
overdone.
stuff.
The
The
spec
reality
didn't
is like the
require
word is
that.
very different from what we
You know,
started.
with the spec, you could,
Yes.
you know, injection mold that accordingly.
It was-
Well, they missed
That was-
the market timing.
Yeah,
Time
Flask-
when people
Yeah,
didn't want
last
that.
was after Django,
Yeah.
Tornado
So by the
was
time
going
people
out,
wanted to
right,
type it.
basic IO
Yeah.
was changed.
So,
everything.
So
anyway,
that's why
the,
that's
the,
like-
the
That was
point,
like a
all those
nice like
ideas
that,
come
too.
together, and I hit
Yeah,
Arm and
so,
ownership,
I mean, Django's great.
and this
but,
code. And what I
because there's a lot
see
of
is,
lines in
I
Django
see it, being completely thorough, covering every case.
Some gets like shifting to
and
single page
being
applications
written.
and stuff too.
Yeah, it's exactly.
It's not easily
basic
readable
is IO,
necessarily.
Not
powering single
necessarily.
page
It's not
applications.
easily
But
readable
it's
necessarily,
not
but it's
usually
organized
Reading a
well.
whole
Yes.
page every time you do a
And
request response
You
cycle
read
thing
it,
is just.
you can
Yeah,
actually
which
spend
is-
a few
which is
weeks
how
when
I
you
think, like, that's-
read every all.
That's my era.
Yeah.
You know, but, oh well, you know.
I don't expect
Maybe not.
much.
I've never looked at Django that deep.
Yeah.
Just use Flask to do the API.
Well, exactly, people just sit
One of the
there
things
based
that we
on
discovered
how
recently
you know,
was
React
that the
or
Flask
and,
SQL Alchemy
you know, in
extension
my mind, that's weird.
is written
but
by the
it's-
same guy.
They
They,
have one that also-
they wrote it,
That's why I'm
and
kind
it
of
is
wondering,
so much
can
easier to
Python and
use
web
than
survive
than
until
trying to use
WebAssembly,
SQL
you know,
Alchemy as
it's
an
like-
add-in.
It is.
So I think sort of
Um,
for me, again,
John had some issues that he dealt with
I mean, Django,
that